The low hum of conversation filled the barracks, a grand hall aboard the war station Torrens Shield, where soldiers from a dozen different species gathered between campaigns. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of alien rations, engine grease, and the faint metallic tang of the recycled air. Holographic lights flickered in patches along the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the room's occupants. Warriors, mercenaries, and hardened veterans of interstellar conflicts. Lieutenant James Carter sat near the edge of the gathering, quietly observing. He wasn't the only human present, but he was the youngest, fresh from his last deployment on the Outer Rim colonies. His uniform bore the marks of combat, scuffed plating, a few hastily patched gashes in the fabric. But his expression remained neutral as he listened to the conversation unravel before him. At the center of the room, a Kregashan soldier bellowed with laughter, his four tusks gleaming under the dim lights. Humans and their ridiculous legends, he scoffed, his voice a guttural growl. Spartans, samurai, knights in shining armor, bah. You tell yourselves these stories because you lack the strength of real warriors. Several others chuckled in agreement. A Xantharian sniper, all sinewy limbs and bioluminescent markings, leaned forward. Tell me, Carter, she said, her voice slithering like silk. Is it true that your people think a single man with a sword once held off an entire army? That your myths glorify warriors who fought hopeless battles and lost? James met her gaze evenly. He knew the stories they spoke of, Leonidas at Thermopylae, Audie Murphy holding his ground against an entire German battalion, the lone samurai who faced death with a steady blade. But before he could answer, a deeper, older voice cut through the noise. Perhaps, said Colonel Robert, War Beast Marshall, stepping into the light. The room fell silent. Marshall was a legend, not just among humans, but across the entire war front. His very presence commanded respect, even from those who had never fought beside him. His battle-scarred armor bore no unnecessary insignia, no need for ornamentation. His deeds spoke for themselves. The Kregashan who had mocked human warriors only moments before shifted uncomfortably, but Marshall showed no outward sign of offense. He took his time, walking toward the fire pit at the center of the room, where soldiers had gathered to share war stories. His expression was calm, unreadable. Then, with a measured voice, he continued, Perhaps our myths seem foolish to you. Perhaps you believe they are just stories. But I wonder, have any of you ever asked yourselves why humans tell them? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Marshall let the silence stretch before he spoke again. We tell them because they remind us of who we are. Because we do not measure warriors by their victories alone, but by their willingness to fight, even when the battle is already lost. His gaze swept the room, challenging anyone to interrupt. No one did. Every species in this war has its strengths, he continued. The Kregashans are stronger than us. The Xantharians are faster. The Urek have warships that outclass anything we can build. But we, his voice dropped, quiet but firm. We have something none of you do. A Urican mechanic, her spined head tilting in curiosity, spoke up. And what is that, Colonel? Marshall's lips curled into the barest hint of a smile. We refuse to break. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the Kregashan warrior, who had been so quick to laugh at human myths, gave a single, reluctant nod. The conversation shifted. No more jabs at human history. No more mockery of their legends. Instead, the soldiers from different worlds listened as Marshall told them the stories. Not of kings and demigods, but of real men and women who had fought in the face of impossible odds. James Carter sat back, watching the way the gathered warriors leaned in, listening. A slow, satisfied smile crossed his face. They were beginning to understand. The laughter in the barracks swelled again, a mix of deep, guttural growls and sharp, clicking sounds unique to each species present. It wasn't cruel, but it carried the distinct tone of superiority, the kind that came from warriors who had fought their battles believing themselves to be the true measure of strength. James Carter remained quiet. He had expected this. Humans were the newcomers to the greater galactic war machine, their achievements impressive, but still questioned by those who had warred among the stars for centuries. The tales of their past, of warriors who fought with steel instead of plasma, seemed laughable to these beings. A Xantharian sniper, her elongated fingers twitching against her rifle strap, grinned at him. "Tell me, human, do you still believe in the myths of your kind? That lone man with blades could stand against armies." A Urek engineer, his chitinous exoskeleton reflecting the dim light, clicked his mandibles. "Yes, yes. Spartans, knights, samurai. All these little tales you tell yourselves." He gestured dismissively. "We have archives on every species. The wars of your people were small, tribal, primitive. You fought over land and food while we waged wars that shaped entire star systems. Your warriors, your so-called legends." He let out a rasping sound that passed for a chuckle. "They are just bedtime stories." More laughter. More nods of agreement. James exhaled slowly. It was the same argument over and over. Humans were frail. They lacked natural armor, had no superior speed, no claws, no fangs. The fact that they had survived at all baffled their allies, and the fact that they thrived unsettled their enemies. Before he could answer, a new presence made itself known. The barracks door slid open with a quiet hiss, and the room fell into an unnatural silence. Not because of the sound, but because of the man who had entered. Colonel Robert, War Beast Marshall. He moved with the measured pace of a man who knew his presence alone carried weight. He was an old soldier, his face lined from years of war, his uniform bearing no unnecessary decoration, only the scars of a life lived in battle. Without a word, he crossed the room and took a seat at the central table. He did not need to announce himself. The gathered warriors shifted, instinctively making space. The bravado in their earlier laughter now tempered by the presence of someone who had seen more wars than most of them combined. Marshall's gaze swept over the room, resting for a brief moment on James before moving to the others. He had heard enough. "You think we tell stories because we need to believe in something that isn't real," he said, his voice quiet but carrying enough weight to silence the last remnants of chuckles. "You laugh at our myths because you think they are just that, myths?" No one answered. Marshall leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "But tell me something. How many of you have fought in a battle where retreat was not an option, where death was not just probable, but certain?" A few hands rose, but not many. Marshall nodded as if he had expected that. "And how many of you have won that battle?" No hands. A slow smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, formed on his face. "That's what I thought." The Urek engineer clicked his mandibles again, a nervous tick. "You speak as though humans are unique in this." Marshall shrugged. "Not unique, no. But unusual? Yes." He tapped a finger against the table. "We don't win because we're stronger. We don't win because we're faster. We win because we refuse to stop fighting, even when every logical outcome says we should already be dead." He let the words settle before continuing. "You think our myths are foolish, but they are not myths. They are memories. Echoes." He sat back, folding his arms. "You think the Spartans were legends? They were real. You think our history glorifies fools who fought against impossible odds." His gaze darkened. "That's because we have always been those fools." Silence. For the first time, the Krigashian who had mocked human warriors said nothing. Marshall stood, pushing his chair back with deliberate ease. "Believe what you want," he said. "Laugh if it helps you sleep at night. But when the next war comes, and you find yourselves standing against an enemy that should be stronger than you, ask yourselves this." He looked at each of them, his gaze lingering just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "What happens when you're the ones trapped with no way out?" His voice dropped lower, just above a whisper. "What happens when you realize you need to become the fools who fight anyway?" With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind only silence. The silence in the barracks lingered long after Colonel Marshall had left. The gathered warriors, once so confident in their mockery, now found themselves unsettled. The humans were strange creatures, unpredictable in ways that defied logic. It was easy to dismiss their stories as fiction, but Marshall's words carried something deeper, an unshakable certainty. James Carter studied the room, watching the subtle shifts in expression. Doubt had crept into the conversation. The Kragasian warrior, once so eager to scoff, now stared into the distance, tusks twitching in thought. The Xantharian sniper, usually quick with a sharp remark, drummed her long fingers against the table in an irregular rhythm. It was the Urek engineer who broke the silence. "You speak of these legends as if they are more than stories," he said, his mandibles clicking in an uncertain pattern. "As if they are warnings." James exhaled slowly. "That's because they are." The Urek's gaze sharpened. "Explain?" James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He could feel the weight of their attention now, the shift from amusement to something resembling curiosity, perhaps even respect. "You think our history is made of myths because you don't understand it," he began. "You think our wars were small because they happened on a single world. But war isn't just about scale. It's about what's at stake." He let the words settle before continuing. "We've fought wars where entire generations were lost. We've fought wars that reshaped the way we thought, the way we existed. And we've fought wars where the only reason we survived was because we refused to stop fighting." The Kragasian snorted. "Every species fights wars." James nodded. "True. But tell me this. How many of your wars ended with your entire species on the brink of extinction?" The Kragasian faltered. James pressed on. "Humanity has faced that. More than once. We nearly wiped ourselves out, by our own hands. And yet, we're still here. Not because we were stronger. Not because we were smarter. But because, somehow, we always found a way to keep going." The Xantharian sniper's bioluminescent markings dimmed slightly. "You speak of these wars as if they were inevitable." James met her gaze. "Maybe they were. Or maybe it's just who we are." He leaned back. "You look at our history, and all you see are stories. But when we look at it, we see a warning." His voice dropped slightly. "Because if there's one thing we've learned, it's that war always comes again." The room was quiet once more. Then, after a long pause, the Kragasian warrior rumbled. "Tell us, human. Tell us of a war that proves your words." James studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you about the last time the world thought we were finished. The last time an empire thought they could break us." He exhaled. "Let me tell you about the Second World War." James let the silence stretch, watching the gathered warriors shift in their seats. The Kragasian warrior's earlier mockery had vanished, replaced with something more thoughtful. The Xantharian sniper's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, an indication of deep concentration. Even the Urek engineer, who had dismissed human history as primitive, now waited in anticipation. "The Second World War," James began, his voice steady, "was a conflict unlike any other in our history. It consumed the entire planet. Dozens of nations, hundreds of millions of people, all drawn into a war that would decide the fate of the world." He paused, letting the sheer scale of it sink in. The enemy was ruthless, their armies vast. They conquered with terrifying speed, crushing everything in their path. Cities burned, entire populations were wiped out, and for a time, it seemed as though no one could stop them. The Kragasian warrior grunted. "And yet they were stopped." James nodded. "Because we refused to surrender. Because when the world was at its darkest, ordinary men and women stood up and chose to fight, even when it meant certain death." He let his gaze drift across the room. "You asked for proof of our warriors. Let me tell you about a man named Vasily Zaitsev." The Xantharian's fingers twitched. "Who was he?" "A sniper," James said. "A hunter from the frozen wilderness who found himself defending a dying city, Stalingrad. It was a place the enemy had to take. They sent thousands upon thousands of their best soldiers to capture it." The room was utterly silent now. But Zaitsev was waiting for them. He didn't fight in the open. He didn't face them head-on. He hunted them, one by one, turning the ruins of his city into a killing ground. He became a ghost, striking from the shadows, forcing an army to fear a single man. The Urek engineer let out a soft click. "One man?" James's expression didn't change. "One man. And there were many like him. Warriors who stood when the world needed them most." He exhaled. "There was Audie Murphy, a soldier who held the line alone against an entire battalion, firing a machine gun from a burning tank until he had nothing left. There was Jack Churchill, who charged in a battle with a sword and longbow, refusing to believe that modern war had made such things obsolete. A slow, almost reluctant respect settled into the expressions of the aliens around him. "And what about the battles they lost?" the Krgashan asked. James didn't hesitate. They fought anyway. There were pilots who took to the skies, knowing they wouldn't return. There were men who stormed beaches under a hail of gunfire, knowing they would never see the other side. They fought not because they thought they would win, but because someone had to. He leaned forward. "That is what you don't understand. Our warriors are not gods. They are not invincible. They are not the strongest or the fastest. They are men and women who should have died, but didn't. Who should have broken, but didn't." He sat back, letting the weight of his words settle. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the Krgashan warrior gave a slow nod. "I think I understand now," he rumbled. The conversation had changed. No longer was it filled with mockery or laughter. Now, there was only contemplation, respect, and perhaps, just perhaps, a hint of fear. The barracks felt different now. The air, once filled with laughter and mockery, was thick with something heavier, something unspoken. The warriors who had once dismissed human myths as foolish now sat in thoughtful silence, their expressions unreadable. The weight of James's words lingered, as though the ghosts of the past had momentarily stepped into the room. The Krgashan warrior, once the loudest in his ridicule, finally spoke. His deep voice, usually filled with confidence, carried an edge of unease. "You're kind. You fight wars as if they are a part of you." James didn't answer immediately. He let the thought settle before responding, his tone calm, yet unwavering. "Because they are. We are not the strongest species. We do not have natural weapons, nor impenetrable armor. We do not live for centuries. But what we have, what has always defined us, is our ability to endure, to adapt, to fight even when survival is impossible." The Xantharian sniper's bioluminescent markings dimmed slightly, a sure sign of unease. It is unsettling, a species that does not break, that refuses to surrender, even when death is certain. James exhaled. "It unsettles us too." The words hung between them. For a moment, there was no reply. Then the Urek engineer, who had earlier dismissed humanity's history as insignificant, clicked his mandibles in contemplation. "Perhaps that is why you are feared." James tilted his head. "Feared?" The Urek's compound eyes glimmered. "Yes, we study war. We analyze tactics. We measure the worth of a species by its ability to wage conflict. And yet, your kind does not fit into any category. You fight when you should surrender. You win when you should be dead. Even your greatest warriors, your legends, are not gods, not genetically superior. They are ordinary, and yet they do the impossible." The Krgashan warrior grunted. "We mock your myths because we do not understand them. But perhaps they are not myths at all. Perhaps they are warnings." James said nothing. The barracks door opened again. The same quiet hiss, the same measured footsteps. Colonel Marshall was back. He surveyed the room, his sharp eyes taking in the changed expressions, the absence of laughter. He said nothing at first. Then, in a voice low and steady, he asked, "Have you learned something tonight?" The Krgashan was the first to answer. He did not meet Marshall's gaze at first, but when he did, his expression was no longer one of amusement. "Yes," he rumbled. "I think we have." Marshall gave a small nod. "Good." His eyes flicked to James, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then, turning to the gathered warriors, he said, "You fight alongside us. You call us allies. But you should understand why humanity fights the way it does. Why we refuse to break." The Xantharian, usually so composed, hesitated before speaking. "And why is that, Colonel?" Marshall's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of countless battles. "Because for us, losing has never been an option." No one spoke after that. As the colonel turned and left, James saw something different in the eyes of the gathered warriors. Respect. And beneath that, buried deep but unmistakable fear.